100 pairs of eyes. That's what it felt like, 100 pairs of eyes, all looking, but none looking at her. They slid past. They glanced away. They found something incredibly interesting on the stone floor. Anything not to meet the gaze of the rejected Luna. Selena stood alone near the edge of the assembly hall, a ghost at a feast held in her own memory. Just 1 week ago, this had been her hall, her pack, her mate. Now, it was a room full of strangers. Her breath hitched, a tiny, traitorous sound, and she forced her spine to straighten. She was Selena of the Mooncrest Pack, daughter of an alpha, once a Luna. She would not break. Not here. Across the hall, he stood. Lucian. Her Lucian. He was laughing, his head thrown back, a sound that used to warm her blood now turning it to ice. His hand rested on the small of another she-wolf's back. Amara. So young. So fertile. The word twisted in Selena's gut like a poisoned blade. Lucian caught her eye for a fraction of a second, and in that moment his smile didn't falter. It became a challenge, a final insult. See what you lost? See what you can never be? Deep down, she knew the truth. This was not just about having pups. This was about power. Lucian, younger than her by a decade, had always felt like he was living in her shadow. As a result, he used his rejection of her to finally feel like the bigger wolf. "He is a fool," a low voice murmured beside her. Selena flinched, turning to see Elder Maeve, her face a roadmap of wrinkles and wisdom. Maeve was one of the few who still met her gaze, but her eyes held a strange sorrow, something deeper than pity. It was an ancient, knowing sadness. "He is the alpha," Selena replied, her voice a hollow whisper. It hurt to say the words. An alpha who casts aside his greatest strength is no alpha at all. He's a liability, Maeve said, her gaze sharp. He thinks a new bloodline will make him strong, but strength isn't just in the pups you sire. It's in the bonds you forge, in the loyalty you earn. Before Selena could ask what she meant, Maeve's eyes flickered toward the pack's northern border. He should be more worried about the whispers on the wind than the whispers in this hall. Whispers? Selena asked, a prickle of unease crawling up her spine. Maeve nodded slowly. They say the Alpha King, King Adric, burned the entire Shadowfall pack to ash for a minor betrayal. Maeve's eyes locked onto hers. What do you think he would do for a crime like this? Breaking a sacred bond in front of the goddess herself? The question hung in the air, heavy and terrifying. She didn't know what scared her more, Lucian's casual cruelty or the idea of a king who ruled with fire and death. In that moment, as if summoned by the thought of broken bonds, Amara turned. The young she-wolf looked directly at Selena, a slow, triumphant smirk spreading across her perfect face. It was not a look of pity. It was a look of victory, pure and simple. And she let it happen. The crack, the tiny fissure in her iron composure split wide open, and for the first time in a week, the numbness receded, leaving behind a pain so sharp, so blinding, it almost brought her to her knees. Her world tilted. She had to get out. Now. The small room they'd given her felt like a cage. It was in the old wing of the pack house, a place for Omegas and the elderly, a place to be forgotten, and it smelled of dust and faded memories. Her memories. Truth be told, she didn't own much. Her life had been the pack. Her things were the pack's things. So, packing was a simple, brutal affair. A few tunics, a spare pair of boots. Then her hand brushed against it, at the bottom of a wooden chest. A small, carved wolf, its wooden body worn smooth from years of her anxious touch. Without thinking, her fingers closed around it. The world faded, and she was back there, 5 years ago. The memory hit her not in images, but in sensations. The acrid smell of ozone and dark magic. The high, keening shriek of a cursed creature ripping through their territory. The feeling of her pack's life force being drained away, sucked into a swirling vortex of shadows. She had been the only one strong enough, the only one with the old magic in her blood to face it. She remembered standing before the abyss, Lucian behind her, screaming her name. "Don't do it, Selena." But she had to, because that's what a Luna does. She protects. So, she had poured her own life force, her magic, her future, into the void to seal it. She had felt it leave her, a cold, hollowing emptiness where warmth and life had once bloomed. The power to create life, sacrificed to save the lives she already had. When it was over, Lucian had held her, called her a hero, his savior. Now, she was just barren, too old. A curse, a single hot tear slid down her cheek, landing on the carved wolf. Her chest ached with a grief so profound it had no sound. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't reconcile the hero she had been with the failure she was now. Maybe it was fate. Or maybe the moon goddess was just cruel. She looked at the small wooden toy, a dream of a child she could never have, a symbol of everything she had lost. She wanted to scream. She wanted to rage at the injustice of it all. Instead, a cold resolve settled in her bones. She couldn't stay here, not to be pitied, not to be mocked, not to slowly fade away into nothing in this dusty, forgotten room. Her wolf, silent for so long, stirred within her, pressing forward with a desperate urge to run. Her fingers tightened, the wood groaning in protest. Between one breath and the next, the wolf shattered in her hand. Splinters bit into her palm, a small, sharp pain that was nothing compared to the gaping wound in her soul. The breaking of the toy was the breaking of her final chain to this place, and it set her free. That night, the moon was a sliver of bone in a black, starless sky. Perfect. Shadows were a rejected wolf's only friend. She moved like one, a whisper on the wind, her pack on her back and the sting of splinters in her palm, the only proof that her past was real. She reached the ridge overlooking the valley, the territory of the Mooncrest pack laid out below. Home. For a single heartbeat, the world shifted, and she almost turned back. The pull of the pack, the bonds. They were a physical thing, a web of connections that were now tearing one by one, leaving her raw and exposed. With every heartbeat, the ache of leaving grew, but the memory of Amara's smirk was stronger. Just below the ridge, hidden by the brush, 2 warriors stood on patrol. Their voices drifted up to her, low and careless. "Pity her, though," said the first, a young wolf named Kale. "To be cast aside like that, after all she did." "Pity?" The other, a bigger, crueler wolf named Forden, scoffed. The sound was like stones grinding together. "She's a dead end, Kale. A barren Luna is a curse on the bloodline. Lucian did what he had to do. The pack needs heirs, not a monument to past glories." The words hit her like a physical blow. A monument, a dead end, a curse, not a hero, not a Luna, not even a wolf worthy of respect. In the span of a breath, the last thread of her doubt snapped. They were not her pack anymore. This was not her home. Because of that, she knew she could never, ever come back. As if fate demanded it, she turned her back on the sleeping valley, on the whispers and the pity and the life she once knew. She didn't know where she was going. She only knew she had to go. The forest held its breath as she slipped over the ridge, leaving the scent of pine and mooncrest soil behind. She plunged into the deep, dark woods of the neutral territories, a lone wolf with nothing but a shattered past and an unknown, terrifying future. And she let it happen, embracing the wild, untamed darkness ahead, because it had to be better than the cloying, suffocating darkness she was leaving behind.
Boredom. That was the primary emotion King Adric felt as he rode along the edge of his vast territory. Boredom and a familiar, grating irritation. The trees were the same. The air held the same scent of damp earth and pine. And his guards were the same. Competent, silent, and utterly terrified of him. As they should be. Fear was a tool, sharp and effective, and he had wielded it for a century to carve out a kingdom where his word was absolute law. He'd built this piece on a foundation of ash and bone, a truth that settled deep in his soul and felt more like a burden than a victory. He was listening to his lead scout drone on about some minor dispute between two border packs, something about hunting rights, when it hit him. The scent. It wasn't a normal scent. It wasn't deer or wolf or rogue. It was impossible. It was moonlight and wild herbs, and a warmth he hadn't realized he was starving for. It was the scent of mate. His mate. 100 years. 100 years he had waited. A lonely, hollow ache in his chest that he had long ago accepted as a permanent part of himself. He had ruled, he had conquered, he had built an empire. All of it alone. He'd resigned himself to the fact that the moon goddess had deemed him unworthy of a partner, perhaps as punishment for the sins he'd committed to secure his throne. And now this scent that was rewriting a century of lonely certainty in a single breath. My king? The scout faltered, noticing the change. Adric didn't answer. His entire being, every primal instinct he possessed, narrowed to a single point of focus. Find her. He spurred his horse, breaking into a gallop, leaving his guards scrambling to follow. The scent was faint, tinged with exhaustion and sorrow. And something else, something faint and stale, like a memory, the scent of another male, another mate. Rage, pure, black, and absolute, surged through him. It was a violation, an impossibility. A mated she-wolf could not be his mate. The laws of the goddess were clear. And yet, the scent was undeniable. His soul, a sleeping beast for 100 years, was awake and roaring her name. He abandoned his horse, shifting in a blur of motion that ripped his fine clothes to shreds. Darkness cloaked him as his form expanded, bones cracking and reforming into the massive black wolf that haunted the nightmares of alphas across the continent. His paws devoured the ground, the wind whipping past his ears. The scent grew stronger, pulling him onward, a string tied directly to his soul. With his scent in the air, he knew this was no trick. This was a truth his body understood before his mind could accept it. He was a king who had everything and nothing, a ruler of all wolves who had no one to call his own. Because of that, this scent wasn't just a discovery. It was a reclamation of a part of himself he thought had died long ago. He burst through a thicket of ancient oaks, and there she was, a lone she-wolf, her silver-tipped fur matted with dirt, her posture defiant even in her clear exhaustion. She was beautiful, not in the way of the young, simpering females who threw themselves at his feet, but in the way of a storm-battered mountain, regal, strong, and unbroken. The moment their eyes locked, time stood still. Hers were the color of moss after a rain, filled with a heartbreaking mixture of fear and pride. He saw her, and his soul didn't just recognize her. It bowed. Mine. The word was not a thought. It was a fact. An axiom upon which his new world would be built. Law or no law. Mated or not. She was his.
Every muscle screamed. Her lungs burned. She had been running for what felt like days, pushing through the dense, unfamiliar woods of the neutral territories on nothing but instinct and the fading adrenaline of her escape. The forest was not friendly here. It was ancient and wild, and it watched her with 1,000 unseen eyes. She was an intruder, a lone wolf, a thing of weakness, a target. Without warning, a scent hit her, so powerful it stopped her in her tracks. Ozone, cold mountain stone, and pure, undiluted dominance. It was the most powerful alpha she had ever smelled, and he was close. Too close. Her wolf pressed forward, hackles raised. Her instincts surged. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at her throat. She dove behind a cluster of moss-covered boulders, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Had Lucian sent hunters? Was this her punishment for fleeing? The undergrowth rustled, and then he emerged from the shadows. The beast was a creature of nightmare. A wolf larger than any she had ever seen, his fur the color of a starless midnight, his eyes glowing with a terrifying golden light. This was no mere alpha. This was a king. Her breath caught. A growl rose in her throat, a pathetic sound against the sheer scale of his power. The great wolf watched her for a long, silent moment. She didn't know what scared her more, the predatory stillness or the unnerving intelligence in those golden eyes. Then, in a movement too fast to follow, the air shimmered and the wolf was gone. In his place stood a man. He was as formidable as his wolf form, tall and broad-shouldered, with an aura of absolute authority that seemed to press down on the very air she breathed. His face was harsh, carved from stone and shadowed by a life of hard decisions, but his eyes were the same. Molten gold, and they were fixed on her with a hungry focus that made her skin burn. As if pulled by a string, she rose slowly from her crouch, her body refusing to show the terror her mind was screaming. She would not die cowering. He took a step forward. "You," he said, and his voice was a low rumble, the sound of an avalanche in a distant valley. It sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with fear. Then, he said the word that shattered her world all over again. "Mine." The word hung in the air, simple, possessive, and utterly insane. I don't know who you think I am," she stammered, taking a stumbling step back. I was mated." The admission tasted like ash. "I know what you were," he growled, closing the distance between them in 2 long strides. He was so close now she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "I care what you are." Before she could move, he reached out, his calloused fingers gently touching her cheek. The moment their eyes locked, the world tilted. It wasn't a spark. It was an inferno, a jolt of pure energy, of warmth and rightness, and a deep, soul-deep recognition flooded her senses. It was a feeling she had never known, a connection that made her bond with Lucian feel like a pale, childish imitation. Her bones remembered him, a man she had never met. Her soul answered his call. Her heart skipped, her voice trembled. "That's impossible." "Is it?" he murmured, his golden eyes searching hers, looking for something she couldn't name. "Tell me it's impossible again." In the stillness that followed, she couldn't, because deep down she knew the truth. This terrifying, impossible king was telling the truth, and that was the most frightening thing of all. He did not give her a choice. One moment she was standing in the forest, her world unraveling, and the next she was being led, his large hand a firm, inescapable brand on her arm. He had shifted back, and now a detail she'd missed before slammed into her. His scent clung to the fine, torn remnants of his clothes. King Adric. Elder Maeve's warning echoed in her mind, the king who ruled with fire. "Where are you taking me?" she asked, her voice stronger than she felt. Her defiance was a thin shield, but it was all she had left. "Home," he answered, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. His home was a fortress. It rose from the peak of a jagged mountain, a citadel of dark, unforgiving stone that clawed at the sky. It wasn't a home. It was a statement, a monument to power and isolation. As they passed through the massive gates, guards in black armor bowed their heads, their eyes carefully averted. Not out of respect, Selena realized, but out of fear. The inside was no warmer. Grand halls echoed with their footsteps. The air was cold and still, and shadows clung to the corners like ancient secrets. He led her to a suite of rooms with a balcony that overlooked a dizzying drop, the wind whining like a mournful ghost. It was luxurious, filled with fine furs and carved wood, but the door was solid oak and the windows were a long way down. It was a gilded cage. "You will be safe here," he said, finally releasing her arm. The space between them burned where his touch had been. "Safe? Or a prisoner?" she shot back, rubbing the tingling skin. His golden eyes narrowed. "Do you see chains, she-wolf? You are my guest." "A guest who was taken against her will. A guest who is not allowed to leave?" she challenged, her pulse racing. He walked to the balcony, staring out at the vast, wild kingdom that was his. "You are the greatest mystery I have ever encountered," he said, his back to her. A she-wolf with the scent of a broken bond, who also carries the scent of my true mate. Such a thing is not possible. It is a violation of the goddess's most sacred law. He turned, his gaze pinning her to the spot. I will not let you leave until I have an answer, until I understand why the goddess would play such a cruel trick on a king who has waited 100 years for a queen. The raw honesty in his voice stunned her. The loneliness. This wasn't just about a broken law. This was personal. Deeply personal. For the first time, she saw past the ruthless king to the burdened man beneath. As a result, her anger faltered, replaced by a confusing swirl of fear and empathy. She was a mystery he had to solve, a puzzle box he was determined to open. She didn't know what scared her more, the fact that he was keeping her here against her will, or the terrifying, treacherous part of her that wanted desperately to see him solve it. Her thoughts spun. She had escaped the cage of her past only to be locked in a fortress of impossible destiny. And as she looked out at the endless expanse of mountains and forests under his control, she knew, with a chilling certainty, that she was more trapped now than she had ever been before. Days bled into one another in the stone fortress. She was not a prisoner, no one laid a hand on her, and the servants brought her food and fine clothes. But she was not free. The gilded cage was a cage all the same. She spent her time exploring the cold, echoing halls, always aware of the guards' watchful eyes. She learned the rhythms of the castle, the silent efficiency, the undercurrent of fear, the absolute devotion to the king who ruled it all. Despite the fear she felt, a strange curiosity took root. Who was this King Adric? This man who defied sacred law for a feeling, for a scent? This king whose soul seemed to call to her own across a crowded room? She found her answer in the great throne room. He had granted her leave to observe, a silent specter near the massive stone pillars. The hall was freezing, the air thick with tension. Adric sat upon a throne carved from a single piece of obsidian, looking less like a king and more like a god of winter. Before him, on his knees, was a captured alpha, a grizzled wolf with defiance still burning in his eyes. He had betrayed an ally, a crime Adric did not tolerate. You broke your oath. Adric's voice was dangerously calm, yet it sliced through the silence like a shard of ice. You sold information to rogues. Your actions cost the lives of 10 wolves. Pups. The captured alpha spat on the floor. They were weak. The strong survive. That is the only law. Selena's breath caught. She expected Adric to explode in rage, to order an immediate execution. She had seen Lucian's temper, hot and petty. But then, Adric did something far more chilling. He smiled. It was a cold, terrifying thing with no warmth in it. You are right, Adric said softly. The strong survive. He leaned forward. Which is why your pack is now mine. Your warriors will swear fealty to me or they will die. Your females and pups will be brought here to my citadel where they will be raised to understand the meaning of loyalty. He paused, letting the words sink in. And you will not be killed. You will be stripped of your wolf, made to live out your days as a man and sent to work the northern mines. You will live a long, long life, remembering the strength you threw away for a few pieces of silver. In that moment, she understood. This was not the senseless cruelty of a tyrant. It was the brutal, calculated justice of a king holding a fractured world together with his bare hands. He was ruthless, yes, but he was not unjust. He had taken everything from the alpha, but he had spared the innocent. Because of that, a flicker of something she refused to name, respect, ignited within her. He had to be this hard. He had to be this cold. Because any sign of weakness in a king like him could shatter the fragile peace he'd built. As the guards dragged the broken, howling man away, Adric's golden eyes lifted, sweeping across the hall until they found hers. The coldness was gone. In its place was a profound, aching loneliness that mirrored the hollow space in her own chest. The tension broke, and in that single glance, she saw not the monster, but the man. A man just as trapped by his crown as she was by his fortress.
Frustration. It was a grinding, unfamiliar feeling. He had faced down armies, slain monsters, and bent entire kingdoms to his will, but he could not solve the puzzle of the silver-furred she-wolf who haunted his castle and his thoughts. Her scent was everywhere. It clung to the furs in her room, a faint whisper in the halls she walked. It was a constant, maddening reminder of what he had found and what he could not understand. He had summoned the oldest member of his court, Oren, the lore-keeper. If anyone had an answer, it would be him. Moments later, the old wolf entered his study. Oren was ancient, his body frail and bent, but his eyes were as sharp as they had been a century ago. He carried a heavy, leather-bound tome. "My king," Oren rasped, bowing low. "Speak," Aedric commanded, pacing before the massive fireplace. "Tell me what the old laws say. Tell me how it is possible for me to have a true mate who was already bonded to another." Oren took a slow, deliberate breath. "It is not possible, my king," he said, his voice a dry rustle of old leaves. "The bond of a true mate is a sacred pact, blessed by the goddess herself. It cannot be broken by any alpha's decree. It cannot fade. It is eternal." He opened the tome, his gnarled finger tracing a line of faded script. "The texts are all in agreement. There has never been a recorded instance of a wolf having a second true mate. Never." The words were a hammer blow to Aedric's certainty. "Then what is she?" he growled, the sound ripping from his chest. "A phantom? A lie?" "I do not know," Oren admitted, and the honesty was more infuriating than any lie. The old wolf looked up, his gaze troubled. "My king, you have many enemies, men who resent your power. Perhaps she is a trick, a curse sent to distract you, to weaken you from within." The air in the room thickened. A low snarl vibrated in Aedric's throat. The idea that Selena, his Selena, was some kind of weapon aimed at him was an insult of the highest order. His wolf pressed against his skin, demanding to be let out, to hunt down this unnamed enemy and tear them to shreds. What's worse, a small logical part of his mind knew Oren's caution was wise, but his soul knew it was a lie. "She is not a curse," Aedric stated, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. He turned from the fire, his eyes blazing with a golden light that made even Oren flinch. "She is my queen." The declaration hung in the air, an oath sworn to the very stones of his castle. He had waited a century. He had ruled alone. He would not let dusty laws and the cautious whispers of old men take this from him. He would not let anyone or anything stand in his way. Not only that, he would protect her from the very world that had cast her out. "Oren," he said, his voice now calm, but with an edge of pure steel. "Your king has given you a new task." "Anything, my lord." "The laws are wrong. Find me the text that was miswritten. Find me the story that was forgotten. Find me a way to prove what I already know to be true."
The one place in the fortress that felt like a sanctuary was the library. It was a vast, circular room lined with thousands of books, smelling of old paper, leather, and forgotten knowledge. Here, she was not the rejected Luna or the king's mysterious guest. She was just Selena. For hours, she lost herself in ancient texts, searching for anything, any mention of a broken bond or a second mate. She found nothing. She was tracing the faded spine of a book on werewolf lineage when his scent announced him, a moment before his footsteps echoed on the stone floor. The air thickened. Her pulse, a quiet rhythm moments before, began to thunder in her ears. Aedric stopped a few feet away, his presence filling the vast, silent space. He didn't speak for a long moment, his golden eyes just watching her. As the silence stretched, she felt a strange mix of fear and anticipation. He was the storm, and she was standing in the eye of it. "Tell me," he said finally, his voice soft but demanding. "What did he do to you?" The question was so direct, so raw, it stole her breath. He wasn't asking about the politics of the rejection. He was asking about the wound. Before she could stop them, the words tumbled out. He held a ceremony. In front of the whole pack, she whispered, the memory of fresh, bleeding thing. He said I was too old, that my womb was barren, a disgrace to his bloodline. She couldn't look at him, staring instead at the book in her hands, her knuckles white. He said my only purpose was to give him an heir, and I had failed. In the quiet that followed, she expected him to say something, to offer pity, or worse, to agree. Instead, she heard a low, guttural growl. She looked up, startled. His face was a mask of cold, murderous rage, but the fury in his eyes wasn't for her. It was for Lucian. Without thinking, she knew with absolute certainty that if her ex-mate were in this room, he would already be dead. Before she could move, he was in front of her. He gently took the book from her nerveless fingers and set it aside. Then, he reached out, his hand hesitating for a fraction of a second before his thumb brushed across her cheek, wiping away a tear she hadn't even realized had fallen. Between one breath and the next, the world exploded. It wasn't a spark this time. It was a tidal wave. A current of pure, undiluted energy surged from his touch, flooding every cell in her body with warmth, with peace, with a feeling of coming home that she had never, ever known. It was a feeling of being shattered and whole all at the same time. Her soul, so long battered and bruised, finally found its anchor. Her mark, the faint, deadened brand from Lucian, tingled with a phantom pain before the new sensation washed it away completely. Her breath caught. What is this?" she whispered, her voice trembling. He leaned closer, his forehead resting against hers, his golden eyes searching deep into her soul. "It is truth," he murmured, his voice thick with a century of loneliness. "It is what I have been waiting for." In that moment, she believed him. All the laws, all the impossibility, it all melted away into nothing. There was only the truth of this connection, this bond that felt more real than the stone beneath her feet. But then, the heavy library doors burst open with a crash. A guard, panting and wide-eyed, stumbled into the room. "My king," he yelled, his voice echoing in the sacred silence. "A delegation has arrived! They are at the gates!" Adric straightened, the tender moment shattered, the cold mask of the king slamming back into place. "Who?" he bit out. The guard swallowed hard, his eyes flicking nervously toward Selena. "It is the Mooncrest Pack, my lord. Their Alpha Lucian. He demands the return of his mate." The throne room was a tomb, silent and cold. Lucian stood before Aedric's obsidian throne, not with the deference of a lesser alpha, but with the slick, confident air of a merchant come to claim his goods. He hadn't even looked at her, not once. To him, she wasn't a person in this negotiation. She was the subject of it, an object, a prize to be reclaimed. The humiliation of it burned hotter than the rejection itself. "King Aedric," Lucian began, his voice smooth and utterly devoid of respect. "There seems to have been a misunderstanding. This female is a member of my pack. She is, in fact, my rejected mate. By sacred law, she is still bound to Mooncrest territory until she is claimed by another of my pack. For her to be here is a crime." Aedric didn't move. He sat on his throne, a predator carved from shadow and stone, his golden eyes fixed on Lucian with a chilling, predatory intensity. The air crackled. The guards shifted, their hands tightening on their weapons. "She is not your mate." Aedric's voice was a low growl, a promise of violence that vibrated in Selena's bones. Lucian laughed, a short, arrogant bark of a sound. "Of course not. She is useless to me, barren." He finally turned his eyes on her, and they were cold, dismissive. It was the same look he'd given her at the ceremony, a look that stripped her of all worth. "But she is still mine, my property, And what's worse, her womb belongs to my bloodline by right of the first mating. Her purpose is tied to my pack, even if she has failed it. Her world tilted. The room, the guards, the kings and alphas, it all faded away into a dull roar. Her womb belongs to my bloodline. He had said it. He had actually said it out loud. He had reduced her entire existence, her sacrifice, her very soul, to a single failed biological function. Something inside her shifted. The shame that had been her constant companion for weeks was suddenly burned away by a clean, white-hot fury. The woman who had fled in the night was gone. The Luna who had endured the pity and the whispers was gone. Before she could think, her body moved on instinct. She stepped out from behind the pillar, her head held high, her gaze locked on Lucian. The entire throne room held its breath. Adric started to rise, a snarl forming on his lips. But she held up a hand, a gesture of command she hadn't made in weeks, and to her shock, he stopped. He actually stopped and watched her. "I am not your property, Lucian," she said, and her voice did not tremble. It rang through the silent hall clear and cold as a winter bell. "I am not a prize to be won or a vessel to be owned." She took another step, her eyes never leaving his. For the first time, she saw a flicker of surprise, of uncertainty, in his face. He wasn't used to being challenged. In that moment, she felt the bond, the real one, the one that pulsed with warmth and golden light, flare with a fierce, possessive pride from the man on the throne. It gave her strength. "I belong to no one," she declared, the words a vow to herself as much as a defiance to him. The silence that followed was absolute. She had not just spoken. She had rewritten the terms of her existence. And in the stunned face of her former mate, she saw a satisfying, unfamiliar glimmer of fear.
Fury. It was a living thing, a beast of fire and shadow coiling in his chest, demanding to be let out. He wanted to tear Lucian limb from limb. He wanted to rip the condescending smirk from his face and salt the earth where he stood. But then, she had spoken. And the beast within him had fallen silent, replaced by a wave of stunned, fierce pride. He had seen the fire in her eyes, the steel in her spine. This was no broken thing to be pitied. This was a queen. His queen. After Lucian had been dismissed, escorted out by guards with the unspoken promise of death if he so much as breathed too loudly, Adric had retreated to his study. He paced before the fire, the scene replaying in his mind. "I belong to no one." The words echoed, a battle cry. But then, a problem remained. The law. Lucian, the arrogant fool, had been right about one thing. The sacred law was on his side. A rejected mate was still bound to the pack. It was a cruel, ancient rule, but it was the law. And Aedric, for all his power, could not simply break it without inviting chaos. Just as his frustration boiled over, the study door creaked open. Oren, the lore keeper, shuffled in, his old face alight with a fervor Aedric had never seen. He clutched a different book this time, not a heavy tome of laws, but a thin, fragile-looking scroll case. "My king," Oren breathed, his voice trembling with excitement. "You told me to find a story that was forgotten." Aedric stopped pacing. "And?" "I found one," the old wolf whispered, carefully opening the case and unrolling a brittle piece of parchment. "It is not a law. It is a prophecy, a forbidden one, suppressed for centuries because it speaks of a time when the old laws must be broken." Aedric's heart, a thing he often thought was made of stone, gave a hard, painful thud. "Read it." Oren cleared his throat, his eyes scanning the ancient spidery script. It says, "When the packs grow corrupt with pride, and bloodlines are valued more than souls, when alphas see their mates not as partners but as property, the moon goddess herself will weep for her children." His voice dropped lower. "And in her sorrow, she will break her own sacred law. She will choose a new Luna, a first mate for all wolves. Not a virgin pup, but a soul of unbreakable loyalty, a spirit tested by the fire of sacrifice. The air thickened. Every word was a chisel, carving a new reality into the stone of Aedric's world. Orin's finger trembled as he continued. This chosen Luna will be marked by a broken bond, a sign of the world's corruption, and she will be given a second chance, a true king to stand beside her. Together, under the light of the blood moon, they will be reborn. And through them, the bond between the wolves and the goddess will be forged anew. The silence that followed was deafening. Aedric stared into the fire, but he didn't see the flames. He saw Selena's face. He saw the pain in her eyes. He saw the fire of her defiance, a soul of unbreakable loyalty, tested by the fire of sacrifice. It wasn't a trick. It wasn't a curse. It was a destiny, a divine mandate. He had not found an impossible mate. He had found the chosen queen of the moon goddess herself. As if fate demanded it, he walked to the window, his gaze sweeping over the vast dark mountains of his kingdom. Far below, on the stone balcony of her rooms, he saw a lone silver figure, Selena, staring up at the moon. And he knew, with a certainty that shook him to his very core, that his entire life, the battles, the loneliness, the ruthless reign, had all been leading him to this single, sacred duty, to protect her until the blood moon rose.
Her body still hummed with the aftershock of her own defiance. She stood on the balcony, the cold mountain wind whipping at her hair, but she didn't feel it. She felt alive, for the first time in so long. Saying those words to Lucian had been like lancing a poisoned wound. It hurt, but it was a clean, healing pain. But then, the fear crept back in. What had she done? She had defied an alpha, her former mate, in front of a powerful king. She had no pack, no allies, no power of her own. She was utterly alone, a guest in a fortress, her fate in the hands of a man she barely knew, a man whose touch set her soul on fire. Her thoughts spun. Who was she now? Not a Luna, not a mate, not just a rejected wolf. So what was left? Selena! His voice right behind her made her jump. She turned to find Aedric standing in the doorway of her room, his golden eyes filled with an expression she had never seen before. It wasn't possession. It wasn't anger. It was reverence. Awe. I need to tell you something, he said, his voice low and serious. He stepped out onto the balcony, the space between them crackling with unspoken energy. He told her everything. He told her about the forbidden prophecy, about a chosen Luna, about a test of sacrifice and a rebirth under a blood moon. He told her that her broken bond wasn't a curse. It was the very sign that marked her as the one. She listened, and with every word, her hope fought against a lifetime of ingrained belief. A part of her wanted to weep with relief, to believe that her suffering had a purpose. But the wound was too deep. No, she whispered, shaking her head. The word was a choked, painful sound. No, that's not possible. The moon goddess, she doesn't choose the barren. She doesn't choose the broken. She abandoned me. Truth be told, that was the one thing she believed with all her heart. She didn't abandon you, Aedric said, his voice fierce with a conviction that almost broke through her walls. She was testing you, forging you into the queen you were always meant to be. Before the words left her lips to argue again, a frantic shout echoed from the courtyard below. The gates! Open the gates! Urgent news for the king! Moments later, the guard from the library burst onto her balcony, his face pale with terror and exertion. He fell to one knee before Aedric. My king, he gasped. A scout from the border. He brings a message. What is it? Aedric demanded, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. The guard looked at Selena, his eyes wide with fear for her. It's Alpha Lucian, my lord. He has allied himself with the rogue packs of the south. He has declared your claiming of Selena a sacrilege, a violation of sacred law. The wind howled, a mournful cry that seemed to echo the guard's next words. He has declared war.
The war room was thick with the scent of old maps and simmering violence. Aedric stood before a massive table, his generals, the most brutal and loyal alphas in his kingdom, arrayed around him. They were wolves of war, their faces scarred and their solutions simple. "We strike here," snarled General Kalen, his thick fingers stabbing the map right at the heart of the Mooncrest Packlands. "A direct assault. We overwhelm them with sheer force, burn their den to the ground, and hang Lucian's hide from the gates before the moon is high. A show of strength." The other generals grunted in agreement. It was their way. It had always been his way. Overwhelming force. No mercy. Because that was the only language their enemies understood. But then, a soft voice cut through the predatory growling. "You will lose half your men if you do that." Every head snapped toward the doorway. Selena stood there, wrapped in a simple gray tunic, looking entirely out of place amongst the hardened warriors. Yet she did not flinch under their combined, hostile stares. In fact, she walked forward, her eyes fixed on the map, her expression serious and focused. Kalen scoffed. What would a Luna know of war? Aedric's eyes narrowed, a low warning growl rumbling in his chest. "She will be heard," he commanded, the authority in his voice turning the air to ice. Silence fell. He nodded to Selena. "Speak." She moved to the table, her slender finger tracing a path on the map, a path his generals had overlooked. "You see this as a den to be attacked," she said, her voice steady. "I see it as a home I ran for 36 years. I know its every secret." Her finger tapped a ridge. "This ridge looks like the best approach, but it is a trap. The ground is soft, riddled with hidden gullies, perfect for an ambush. Lucian will expect a direct assault because his pride demands it. He thinks you see him as a great warrior to be met head-on." She looked up, meeting Kalen's glare without fear. "But Lucian is not a great warrior. He is a vain, predictable bully. His vanity is his weakness. And that is what you should attack." She pointed to a winding, seemingly insignificant river to the east. "His forces will be massed here, at the main pass, waiting for your glorious charge. But his allies, the rogue packs, their loyalty is thin. They are here for spoils, not for Lucian's honor." She then traced a path through the forest along the river. "Send a small, fast force through here to their rear encampment. Not to fight, but to raid their supplies, burn their food, steal their weapons. When the rogues see their reward disappearing, their morale will break. They will abandon him before the real battle even begins." The room was silent. His generals stared, their expressions shifting from scorn to disbelief and then to a grudging respect. It was a brilliant plan. A plan that saw the enemy not as a faceless horde, but as a collection of greedy, flawed individuals. It was a plan that would save hundreds of his warriors. It was the plan of a queen. He looked at Selena. Truly, looked at her. He saw the fire of the prophecy, the wisdom of a leader, and the unwavering strength of his mate. In that moment, something inside him shifted. For the first time, the crushing weight of his crown felt lighter, because he was no longer carrying it alone. "General Kalen," Aedric said, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "You will lead the diversionary force. Follow the Luna's plan to the letter." He then turned his gaze to the rest of them. "The rest of you are with me. We will give Lucian the glorious charge he is expecting, right after his allies have tucked their tails and run." His generals, without another word of protest, bowed their heads. "Yes, my king." But as he watched Selena, a new, cold fear slithered into his heart. He had put his trust, his army, and the fate of his kingdom in her hands. And he knew, with a terrifying certainty, that if anything happened to her, he would burn the entire world down.
War was not a glorious charge. It was chaos. It was the stench of sweat, blood, and fear. It was the screams of the dying and the savage snarls of wolves fighting tooth and claw. Her plan had worked. Just as she'd predicted, The rogue packs had scattered the moment their supply train went up in flames, their howls of outrage quickly fading into the night. What remained of Lucian's army was a core of Mooncrest loyalists, now outnumbered and caught completely by surprise. Selena was kept in the rear, guarded by Aedric's most trusted warriors, a position she both resented and was grateful for. Her role was not to fight, but she could not tear her eyes away. From her vantage point on a low hill, the battle unfolded below like a nightmare. She saw Aedric, a whirlwind of death and fury in his massive wolf form, his black fur a stark contrast to the crimson blood splattering the forest floor. He moved with a brutal grace, a king protecting his own. Her heart ached with a terrifying mixture of pride and terror. That was her mate, her king. But then, amidst the chaos, she saw something that made her blood run cold. A warrior, smaller than the rest, was fighting with a desperate, familiar ferocity. As he shifted to meet a charge, the moonlight caught his face. Alpha Valerius. The name was a gasp on her lips. Valerius, the Alpha of the Stone River Pack. A man whose entire family had been saved from a plague by Aedric's own healers 5 years ago. A man who had sworn a public life debt to the Alpha King. And he was here, fighting for Lucian, fighting against the very man who had saved him. The sight was a betrayal so profound it felt like a physical blow. This wasn't just about the law anymore. Lucian hadn't just gathered allies, he had preyed on old wounds and simmering resentments. How many others were down there, fighting not for Lucian's pride, but out of some hidden grudge against Aedric's iron-fisted rule? As if the forest watched, the battle began to turn. The Mooncrest warriors, though outnumbered, were fighting on their home ground with the desperation of cornered animals. Valerius rallied a group, their charge breaking through Aedric's flank. Her instincts surged. Without thinking, she scanned the battlefield, her mind racing, looking for a weakness, an opening, anything. Her eyes landed on the stream, the one they had used for their raid. The banks were steep here, muddy from a recent rain. Before the words left her lips, she was screaming to the guard captain beside her. "The stream! Push them to the stream! The banks won't hold!" The captain, trusting the word of the Luna whose plan had already saved them, relayed the order. The horns blew a new command. Aedric's forces changed their tactics, not just fighting but hurting their opponents. They pushed Valerius's flank back, step by step, toward the muddy, treacherous stream bank. Valerius, caught up in the heat of battle, didn't see the trap until it was too late. With a final, coordinated shove, Aedric's warriors sent them tumbling down the slick mud, their charge broken, their formation shattered. The battle was won. But as Selena watched the tired, bloodied warriors regroup, a cold dread settled in her stomach. They had won this fight, but she had seen the truth of the war. They weren't just fighting Lucian. They were fighting the ghosts of Aedric's past. And she knew, with a heavy heart, that she had to tell him. She had to tell him about the betrayal, and she had no idea what that knowledge would do to the man who was just starting to let her see his soul.
Victory should have tasted sweet. It tasted like ash. He stood in his command tent, the sounds of the celebrating camp a dull roar outside. He had shifted back, his body aching, but it was his soul that felt the deeper wound. The victory had been Selena's. Her mind, her strategy, had saved his men. And all he had done was unleash the beast. He felt the familiar cold distance settling over him, the armor of the ruthless king sliding back into place. The tent flap opened, and she entered. Her face was pale in the lantern light, her eyes dark with a worry that had nothing to do with the battle they had just won. "The losses were minimal," he said, his voice flat, trying to reassure her. "Your plan was flawless." "It's not that," she said softly, her gaze unwavering. "Aedric, I saw someone in the battle, fighting for Lucian." She took a deep breath. It was Valerius. The name, It was a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for 50 years. A lock on a room deep inside him where he kept his rage, his grief, and his greatest failure. The world narrowed to a pinpoint. The sounds of the camp faded. The warmth of the tent vanished, replaced by an arctic cold that started in his chest and spread through his veins. He didn't see Selena anymore. He saw another face, a different traitor, an alpha named Lycan, a man he had called friend, a man whose betrayal had not just started a war. It had led to the slaughter of his entire family. It had led to the death of his younger sister, Alara. She had been only 16. He could still hear her screams. Lycan had been bought, just as Valerius must have been. And Aedric had been too busy, too arrogant, too trusting to see it, until it was too late. Aedric? Selena's voice was a distant echo. Without another word, he turned away from her, walking to the opening of the tent and staring out into the darkness. The beast inside him, the one she had managed to soothe, was awake and clawing at the walls of his soul. It wanted blood. It wanted vengeance. It wanted to burn the world down so no one could ever betray him again. He swore a life debt, Aedric said, his voice a dead, hollow thing. The king was gone. Only the killer remained. I know, she said, stepping closer. He could feel her warmth, her worry, like a brand on his cold skin. Which means Lucian is preying on more than just the law. He is finding every crack in your armor, every old wound. Then I will leave him no one to prey on. He interrupted, the words tasting like poison and promise. I will wipe them all from this earth, Valerius, his pack, his pups, his memory. I will salt the ground where his den stood, just like I should have done 50 years ago. Aedric, no, she pleaded, her hand reaching for his arm. That is not justice. That is the very thing they resent you for. It will only create more traitors, more ghosts. He flinched away from her touch as if it were fire. He couldn't let her in. Not now. If she saw the monster in this room, she would run. And he couldn't bear that. So he let the coldness win. He let the armor seal him in. He turned to face her, and he made sure his eyes were the flat, merciless gold of the king everyone feared. You gave me victory in one battle, Selena. For that, you have my gratitude. But you will not tell me how to win a war. The hurt in her eyes was a physical blow, but he didn't let himself feel it. He couldn't. Between them, something cracked. The beautiful, fragile bridge they had been building between their souls fractured under the weight of his past. If you do this, she whispered, her voice aching with a sorrow that was all his fault. If you let this rage consume you, you are no different than him. And before he could speak, before he could call her back and tell her she was wrong, that he needed her, she turned and walked out of the tent, leaving him alone in the darkness with his ghosts.
The camp was a ghost of what it had been. The quiet celebration of their victory was gone, replaced by a tense, cold silence that was sharper than any blade. It radiated from one wolf, and one wolf alone. Aedric. He moved through the camp like a storm cloud, his face a mask of stone, his golden eyes holding the flat, merciless light of a winter sun. He was the king, every inch of him. But the man, the one who had looked at her with such reverence, was gone. He did not speak to her. He did not even look at her. The bridge between them was not just cracked. It was a chasm of frozen silence. Without warning, a scout, mud-splattered and bleeding, burst into the command tent. My king, Lucian's forces. They're regrouping at the old watchtower pass. A small contingent. It looks like he's preparing to flee. Aedric's head snapped up. A predatory light entered his eyes. He's not fleeing, he growled. He's baiting me. It's a trap, Aedric, Selena said, stepping forward, her voice low and urgent. He knows you are angry. He knows you will not resist a chance to crush him personally. He is using your rage against you, just like I warned. Aedric finally turned to look at her, and his gaze was so cold it made her flinch. "I am aware," he said, his voice clipping the words. "And I will spring his trap, and then I will hang him with it." He turned to his generals. "We ride, a full direct assault. I want every warrior we have. We will grind him and his watchtower to dust." "No," Selena pleaded, stepping in front of him, her heart hammering against her ribs. "That's what he wants. He will have the high ground, a bottleneck pass. You will be walking your men into a slaughter. Let me think of another way. A better way." "I am done with clever ways," he snarled, his voice a lash of thunder that made the entire tent fall silent. He publicly, brutally cut her down. "Your counsel is no longer required, Luna. You will remain here, where you are safe." The words were a physical blow. He had not just dismissed her plan. He had dismissed her. He had put her back in her place as a female to be protected, not a queen to be consulted. And before she could say another word, he was gone, sweeping out of the tent with his generals in his wake, the air crackling with his cold fury. She was left standing there, her heart a block of ice in her chest, the prophecy feeling like a cruel, distant joke. What followed was an agonizing wait. Hours stretched into an eternity, the silence of the camp broken only by the howl of the wind. Then the horns blew from the south, a frantic, desperate sound, the sound of defeat. The camp erupted into chaos. It wasn't a battle cry, it was a scream of terror. Warriors scrambled for weapons, their faces pale with shock. From the north, from their unprotected flank, a second army poured out of the woods, Lucian's forces. It had been a diversion. The real attack was here. Selena's blood ran cold. He had sent every warrior with Aedric. The camp was barely defended. Without thinking, her wolf surged forward. She shifted, a blur of silver fur and desperate courage, throwing herself into the fray. She fought with the ferocity of a cornered Luna, her claws and teeth finding their mark. But for every rogue she took down, 3 more took its place. They were overwhelmed. Then, a scent cut through the chaos. Pine and arrogance. Lucian. He stood on a small rise in his human form, watching the slaughter with a triumphant smirk. Their eyes met across the battlefield, and in that moment, she knew. This had never been about the watchtower. It had always been about her. Her world tilted as a heavy blow sent her tumbling to the ground. Before she could rise, strong hands grabbed her, binding her arms. She struggled, snarling and snapping, but it was useless. Lucian walked toward her, his smirk widening. He knelt, grabbing her face in his hand, forcing her to look at him. "Hello, mate," he purred, his voice dripping with venomous victory. "Did you miss me?" The last thing she saw before they dragged her into the darkness was the look of utter horror on the face of one of Aedric's guards, as he watched his king's greatest treasure and his greatest failure be stolen away.
Blood. The taste of it was in his mouth, the smell of it thick in the air. He fought like a demon, his rage a bottomless well of fuel. The trap had been sprung, a brutal, bloody ambush in the narrow pass. But he was the Alpha King. He and his warriors were a storm of tooth and claw, and they were winning. They were pushing Lucian's forces back, inch by bloody inch. But something was wrong. A cold dread coiled in his gut. This was too easy. Lucian's men were fighting hard, but they were falling back too readily. This wasn't the final, desperate stand of a cornered alpha. This was a delay, a distraction. As if fate demanded it, the sound of a distant horn reached him, carried on the wind from the direction of his camp. A horn of alarm. The truth hit him like a physical blow, a 2-pronged attack. And he had sent every single warrior here, with him. He had left her. Alone. Defenseless. "Back!" he roared, the command ripping through the chaos of the battle. "Back to the camp now!" He didn't wait for his men. He turned and ran, a black bolt of terror-fueled lightning. He ran faster than he had ever run in his life, his heart pounding with a single desperate prayer to a goddess he had long ignored. Let me be wrong. Please. Let me be wrong. He wasn't. The camp was a disaster. Tents were burning. The wounded were crying out. and the air was thick with the smell of defeat. He searched frantically, his eyes scanning the chaos for a flash of silver fur. He found one of his personal guards, clutching a deep wound in his side, his face ashen. "My king!" the wolf gasped. "Where is she?" Adric demanded, the words a raw, guttural plea. The guard's eyes filled with a terrible shame. "He took her, my lord. It was a raid, meant only for her. Lucian, he took the Luna." No. The word was a silent scream in his soul. The world dissolved into a gray, featureless void. His rage, the fire that had driven him, was gone, doused by a tidal wave of ice-cold failure. He had done it again. He had let his past, his pride, his trauma, blind him. And because of it, he had failed to protect the one person he was destined to cherish. He had failed his queen. The long ride back to the citadel was a silent, grim procession. His warriors could feel his despair, a cold, dark void that seemed to suck all the warmth from the air. He walked into the throne room, the heavy doors closing behind him with a sound of finality. His eyes fell upon the two thrones, one, his own, dark and imposing. The other, the one he had commissioned for her, was made of silver birch, waiting, empty. The sight broke him. The king, the warrior, the beast, it all crumbled away, leaving only the man. A man drowning in a century of grief. A man who had lost his sister to one betrayal, and now his soulmate to another. His legs gave out, and he collapsed onto the steps before his own throne, not a king, but a supplicant before a ghost. The silence of the vast hall was a crushing weight. He had failed her. He had proven her right. His rage had made him no different from Lucian. He had become the monster she warned him about, and he had lost everything.
Darkness. Then a familiar hated scent. Dust, faded memories, and the ghost of a dream. She opened her eyes, and her heart stopped. She knew this room. The sloping ceiling, the single, small window, the faint carvings of tiny animals on the wooden walls. She was in the nursery. Lucian had not just imprisoned her. He had brought her back to the very heart of her deepest pain. It was a deliberate, psychological cruelty that was more painful than any physical chain. The door creaked open, and he stood there, silhouetted by the hallway light. He was smiling. "Welcome home," he said, his voice dripping with smug satisfaction. He walked in, carrying a small stool, and sat down as if he were visiting a sick friend. "I thought you'd be more comfortable here. A reminder of your purpose." A growl rose in her throat, but it was a weak, tired sound. "Oh, don't be like that," he sighed, feigning disappointment. "Your king is probably dead, you know. He walked right into my trap just like the arrogant beast he is. All that power, and he was undone by a bit of wounded pride. Pathetic." She stared at him, her mind numb with shock and despair. "But don't you worry," he continued, leaning forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I still have a use for you. Once Aedric's little kingdom crumbles, the Pax will need a symbol of stability, a return to the old ways. And you and I, we are a powerful symbol, the sacred first bond. They will rally to us. I will die before I stand by your side again," she spat. He laughed. "You won't have to stand. You'll just have to be. My tragic, broken mate, rescued from the clutches of a heretic king. It's a good story." He stood up, dusting off his hands. "You see, Selena, that's all you ever were. A story. A pretty decoration. And when you couldn't fulfill your one true purpose, you became a tragedy. You were a curse on my bloodline, and you became a curse on his kingdom." He walked to the door and paused, looking back at her. "Deep down, you know the truth, don't you? You are broken. And everything you touch, it breaks too." Then he left, the heavy bolt of the lock sliding home with a deafening thud. She was alone. In the dark. In the nursery. His words echoed in the crushing silence. Broken. A curse. Everything you touch, it breaks too. And she believed him. All the defiance, all the hope the prophecy had given her, it all crumbled into dust. Adric was gone. Her pack hated her. Her king was dead because of her. She had been a fool to believe she could be anything more than what she was, a barren, worthless she-wolf, a failure. She curled into a ball on the cold, hard floor, the same floor where she had once dreamed of her children playing. The last of her strength drained away, leaving a hollow, aching void. She didn't cry. She was beyond tears. She was in a place of utter, absolute despair. Her wolf went silent. The faint pulse of the bond with Aedric faded into nothing. She was completely, utterly alone. She closed her eyes, praying to a goddess she no longer believed in, not for rescue, not for strength, but for the sweet, simple mercy of an end. She had lost. But then, in the deepest, darkest part of the room, a soft silver light began to glow. It was no bigger than a firefly, faint and fragile, but it was there, and it felt warm. The silver light pulsed. It was a tiny, impossible star born in the suffocating darkness of the nursery, and it pulsed in time with a heartbeat that was not her own. At first, she thought it was a trick of her grieving mind, a final, cruel hallucination before the end. But then the light grew, casting soft, ethereal shadows on the walls, and the warmth intensified, pushing back the bone-deep cold of her despair. The light was not just light. It was a feeling. It was a presence. Without warning, a wave of memories flooded her, but they were not her memories of pain. Instead, she saw herself as a pup, defending a smaller wolf from a bully. She felt the fierce pride of her first successful hunt. She relived the moment she'd poured her life force into the void, not as a moment of loss, but as a moment of ultimate, selfless love for her pack. These were memories of her strength, her loyalty, her very soul. The light wasn't showing her what she had lost. It was reminding her of who she had always been. "You were not abandoned," a voice whispered, not in her ears, but in the deepest part of her spirit. It was a voice of moonlight and ancient starlight, a voice she knew as well as her own. The moon goddess. You were forged. A single tear, not of sorrow but of stunned, dawning comprehension, traced a path through the grime on her cheek. But I am barren, she thought, the old wound aching. I failed. You sacrificed your blood to save your pack, the presence answered, the light flaring with a gentle, loving intensity. You offered the future of your own line for the future of all. Do you think such a love is a failure in my eyes? The unspoken question hung in the air. Do you not see that this is precisely why you were chosen? In the span of a breath, the lie that had poisoned her life shriveled and died. Her worth was never in her womb. Her purpose was never to be a vessel. Her strength was her sacrifice. Because of that, Lucian's words, his rejection, his entire worldview built on bloodlines and pride, seemed suddenly small, pathetic, an insult to the great cosmic truth now filling her soul. Her wolf, so long silent and defeated, stirred within her. It did not rise with a snarl of rage, but with a deep, calm, and unshakable certainty. Her bond with Aedric, the one she thought had faded, pulsed back to life, a steady, golden thrumming in her veins. He was alive, wounded, yes, grieving, but alive. Deep down, she knew the truth. The prophecy was real, and the time was coming. So, when the heavy bolt on the door scraped open hours later, the guards did not find a broken, weeping woman curled on the floor. Instead, they found a queen. Selena stood in the center of the room, bathed in the pale light of the moon from the small window. Her clothes were torn and she was covered in dirt, but her spine was straight, her head was high, and her eyes glowed with a faint, otherworldly silver light. She was no longer a prisoner. She was a reckoning waiting to happen. The guards stopped dead, their hands on their swords, a primal fear in their eyes. They weren't looking at a rejected she-wolf. They were looking at the living avatar of their goddess, and they were terrified.
The throne room was his tomb. He had not moved from the steps, the cold stone leaching the warmth from his body, mirroring the frozen wasteland of his soul. His guards had left him, his generals had retreated, leaving him alone with the ghosts of his failure. Ilara, Selena, 2 names, 2 soul-deep wounds, both carved by his own damned pride. He had lost his army's trust, he had lost his tactical advantage, and most importantly, he had lost her. What was the point of a kingdom if you had no one to share it with? What was the meaning of a crown in an empty hall? My king. The voice, rough and familiar, broke the suffocating silence. Adric didn't look up. Leave me, Kaelin, he rasped, his voice a stranger to his own ears. The heavy footsteps of his general did not retreat. Instead, they stopped beside him. I will not, Kaelin said, his voice surprisingly gentle. 50 years ago, after the betrayal, my father told me you locked yourself away. He said you came out a week later, not a prince, but a king of iron and ice. He said you built this entire kingdom on the foundations of your own pain to ensure no one would ever suffer as you did. Adric remained silent, the old memories twisting in his gut. You did not fail them then, my king, Kaelin continued, his voice thick with an emotion Adric had never heard from him. And you have not failed us now. You were betrayed. We were baited. But we are not broken. Finally, Adric looked up at his most hardened general. He saw no judgment in Kaelin's scarred face, only a fierce, unwavering loyalty. I left her, Adric whispered, the confession tearing from his throat. My rage. I let it blind me. I pushed her away, and I left her defenseless. Yes, Kaelin agreed, his honesty a sharp, clean blow. You did. And now you will go and get her back, because that is what our king does. He does not surrender. As if pulled by a string, Adric looked at the empty, waiting throne of silver birch. He saw her face, her defiance, her belief in him. He had been so focused on the monster he was afraid of becoming that he had forgotten the man she saw. A man worthy of a queen. A man who could be more than just his rage. That's why he had to try. He had to be that man. For her. Slowly, painfully, Adric rose to his feet. He was no longer the broken man on the steps. He was the king, remade not by rage, but by the humbling agony of his own failure. He turned to Kaelin, his eyes no longer empty, but filled with a cold, clear, and absolute purpose. Moments later, he stood before the survivors of his army. They were a battered, disheartened group, their morale shattered. He did not climb onto the platform to address them. He stood on the ground with them. One of them. I failed you, he said, his voice carrying across the silent camp. My pride led us into a trap. My rage left our flank exposed. My actions led to the capture of my Luna, your queen. He took a deep breath, letting the full weight of his confession settle. I do not ask you to fight for a king who has failed. I do not ask you to fight for this kingdom, or for glory. He drew his sword, the steel ringing in the cold air. I ask you to fight for her, for the one soul who looked upon this broken world and believed it could be better, for the queen the goddess herself has chosen to lead us out of the darkness. He looked into the eyes of his warriors, man to man, wolf to wolf. I am going to get my mate back. Will you stand with me? For a heartbeat, there was only silence. Then, one warrior slammed his fist over his heart. Then another, and another, until the entire army was a forest of raised fists and snarling, devoted faces. They did not cheer. It was something deeper, a solemn, unbreakable vow. Adric looked to the sky. A sliver of the moon was visible, and its edge was tinged with a faint bloody red. Time was running out. Tonight, he roared, his voice filled with the promise of a coming storm. The blood moon rises, and so will our Luna. The world was a blur of motion and the scent of blood. The assault on the Mooncrest camp was not a battle. It was a force of nature. Adric fought not with the blind rage of before, but with the focused, chillingly precise lethality of a surgeon. His every move had one purpose, one single solitary goal that eclipsed all else: get to her. His warriors moved with him, a wave of black fur and righteous fury, their loyalty forged anew in the fires of their king's humility. They crashed against Lucian's defenses, a desperate final stand on the Alpha's home ground. The air was filled with the sounds of the clash, but in Aedric's mind, there was only a single, silent mantra. Selena, Selena, Selena.
She was a ghost in her own home. After her transformation, the guards had been too terrified to touch her, leaving her locked in the nursery but otherwise alone. She had spent the precious hours learning the patrol routes she herself had set years ago. She knew the weaknesses of this den better than anyone. As the sounds of Aedric's attack finally reached her, she put her plan in motion. Slipping out a loose window board, she moved through the chaos like a shadow. She wasn't heading for the fight. She was heading for the betrayer. She found Alpha Valerius near the back lines, his face a mask of conflict. "Valerius," she said, her voice calm amidst the chaos. He spun, his eyes widening in shock. "Luna Selena?" "He saved your children," she said, her voice cutting through his defenses. "Aedric, he saved them from the plague. Do you remember?" His face paled. It is not so simple." "It is exactly that simple," she pressed, stepping closer. "Is your honor for sale? Is this man," she gestured toward the center of the fighting, toward Lucian, "worth the price of the life debt you swore? The goddess is watching, Valerius. Choose your side." As the truth of her words unraveled, something inside him broke. He looked from her glowing eyes to the battle, to the black wolf that fought like a vengeful god for his mate. Between them, something cracked. Just as Aedric finally broke through the last line of Lucian's personal guard, Valerius let out a roar of fury and turned on the wolves beside him, fighting now not for the betrayer, but for the king he had wronged. The tide had turned. Selena ran, her heart pounding, toward the center of the camp. She saw Aedric, his wolf form bloodied but unbroken. And she saw Lucian, his face a mask of disbelief and rage as his forces crumbled around him. She burst into the clearing just as Aedric threw a warrior aside. Their eyes met across the chaos. Time stood still, and in the sky above, the moon, full and impossibly large, finally bled completely, totally, and utterly crimson. The blood moon had arrived.
The world narrowed to a single point of light, to Selena. The moment their eyes locked, the chaos of the battle, the screams, the scent of blood, it all faded into a dull, distant roar. The light of the blood moon washed over the clearing, not with a feeling of menace, but with a phantom warmth on her skin, a hum of ancient waiting power. He was here. He had come for her. Without another word, Aedric let his human form ripple back into existence. He stood, his body covered in blood and dirt, his chest heaving, but his golden eyes never left hers. He wasn't a king in that moment. He was just a man, a wolf, protecting the center of his entire world. Lucian, seeing his forces broken and his allies turned against him, finally let out a roar of pure, unadulterated fury. His face was a contorted mask of hatred, his eyes wild. "You!" he screamed, not at Aedric, but at Selena. "This is your fault, you barren, worthless witch. If you had just stayed broken, none of this would have happened." In the span of a breath, he lunged, not for the king who had defeated him, but for the woman who had defied him. It was his last petty, pathetic act of possession, but he never reached her. Aedric moved like a blur of shadow, intercepting him with a crash of bone and muscle that shook the ground. The two alphas met, not as wolves, but as men, a brutal, desperate tangle of fists and fury. It was a short, savage affair. Lucian fought with the sloppy rage of a cornered rat, while Aedric fought with the focused, deadly precision of an executioner. He slammed Lucian to the ground, his hand raised, claws extending, ready to rip his throat out. No! The command was not a shout, but it cracked through the air with the force of thunder. Adric froze, his claws inches from Lucian's throat, his head snapping toward her. Selena walked forward, stepping out of the shadows and into the full crimson light of the moon. A faint silver aura shimmered around her, her eyes glowing with a power that was not her own. This was not her fight to win with claws. This was her truth to declare. "Get up, Lucian," she said, her voice impossibly calm. He scrambled to his feet, his eyes wide with a new kind of fear. He was no longer looking at the woman he rejected. He was looking at something he didn't understand. "You who value blood over soul," she began, her voice gaining strength, resonating with the power of the moon above. "You who value power over loyalty. You who value pride over love. You see me as broken." She took a step closer, and he stumbled back. "The goddess sees me as forged. You called me a curse on your bloodline. The goddess calls me the future of ours." She raised her hand, not to strike, but simply pointing at him. The silver light around her intensified, a blinding, beautiful nova. "You are not an alpha. You are a sacrilege. A blight on the name of the pack you were meant to lead. And your rule is over." Beneath the moonlight, the remaining warriors of the Mooncrest pack looked from the cowering, hate-filled man to the radiant, powerful Luna. And they chose. One by one, they fell to their knees. Not before Aedric, but before her. Lucian stared, his face a mess of disbelief and horror. His own pack, his own warriors. They had abandoned him. He was nothing. A growl rose in her throat, a sound of finality, of judgment. He was the one who was broken. He was the one who was barren of spirit. The tension broke. Lucian, truly and utterly defeated, let out a pathetic whimper and collapsed. A king of nothing, alone in a circle of his own shame.
In the quiet that followed, there was only the sound of the wind sighing through the pines and the heavy breathing of weary warriors. The red light of the moon softened. Its judgment passed. Aedric walked to her side. He didn't say a word. Instead, he gently took her hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers, and the bond between them, the one that had pulsed with desperation and fury, now settled into a deep, calm, and steady rhythm of pure love. It was over. He led her away from the clearing, away from the watching eyes and the defeated specter of her past. He led her to a small hidden glade, where a waterfall cascaded over mossy rocks into a still pool, the water reflecting the crimson moon like a bowl of liquid fire. Here, alone with the forest as their witness and the goddess as their priestess, their new life began. "Selena," he murmured, his voice thick with a century of emotion. He turned to face her, his golden eyes raw with a vulnerability she had never seen. "In my long, lonely life, I have never seen anything as beautiful or as strong as what you did tonight." Her chest ached, a sweet, healing pain. "And I have never felt more whole than when I knew you were fighting for me." As if fate demanded it, he slowly lowered his head. He didn't kiss her. Not yet. Instead, he gently turned her head, exposing the soft, pale skin of her neck. She knew what was coming. Her heart skipped. Her breath caught. The mark from Lucian, long since a dead, faint scar, tingled one last time before vanishing into nothing. He hesitated for a single heartbeat, his breath warm against her skin. "Mine?" The question was in his eyes, a final plea for her consent, her choice. "Yours," her soul answered, and she let it happen. His teeth, sharp and possessive, sank into her flesh. The pain was a flash of white-hot fire, but it was instantly followed by a wave of pure, unadulterated bliss. A current of liquid gold poured into her, filling every empty, broken space inside her. She felt him, his strength, his loneliness, his fierce devotion, his unending love. All of it became a part of her. And she poured herself back into him, her resilience, her loyalty, her sacrifice, her love. She cried out, a sound of both pain and pleasure, and marked him in return, her own teeth claiming the warm, strong column of his throat. Their bond, prophesied and forged in fire, was sealed. When they finally pulled apart, gasping, the world was different. It was brighter, clearer. And as the full power of their connection settled in her bones, she felt something new. It wasn't just him she felt. She could feel the heartbeats of the warriors in the camp. She could feel the fear of the captured and the hope of the victors. She could feel them all. She was no longer just Selena. She was no longer just Aedric's mate. She was the Luna of them all.
Dawn. The sky bruised purple and pink, chasing away the last of the blood-red shadows. The world felt new, cleansed. He stood with Selena on the ridge overlooking the valley, the same ridge from which she had fled, a broken wolf. Now she stood beside him as a queen. Below, the two packs mingled, his own black-furred warriors and the silver-furred wolves of Mooncrest. They were tired, battered, but there was no tension, only a quiet, hopeful exhaustion. They were one pack now. He looked at her, at the way the morning light caught the silver in her hair, the new, confident light in her eyes. The weight of his crown, a burden he had carried alone for so long, was gone. Because he was no longer alone. Because of that, he knew the future was not something he had to command, but something they would build. "What now?" he asked, his voice quiet. He, the Alpha King who had never asked for counsel, was asking his queen to lead. Selena looked out at the valley, at the wolves who were now hers to protect. A soft, genuine smile touched her lips for the first time. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "Now," she said, her voice filled with a warmth that promised a new season, "we heal." She knew they would follow him because he was strong, but as she started down the ridge to walk among her new people, he saw the looks on their faces. They would love her because she was kind. He watched her go, his heart full to bursting. The prophecy was fulfilled. His mate was home. His queen had risen. And for the first time in 100 years, the Alpha King was not afraid of the ghosts of the past because he was finally, truly, looking toward the future.